Welcome, everyone, to Nerd of the Rings. We have a very special guest that we are welcoming back to the channel today, Mr. Brian Sibley, who, as of today, has a new book out, The Fall of Númenor. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be with you again, Matt. Great to see you.
So, we're very excited for Fall of Númenor, especially those like me who love diving into Tolkien's works. And in order to look at the Second Age, we have to look at a number of books previously. We've had to look at a number of books and kind of go scattershot throughout Tolkien's entire library. So, tell us about The Fall of Númenor for those who aren't familiar with what this book is.
Yes, certainly. Well, it's all now in one book, and I'll show it to you here. I'm picking up a pile of papers while I do that. But and incidentally, thanks for talking to me so early, Matt. It's I know it's early in the morning your time. It's not quite so early in the morning here, but this is my I'm having my second breakfast cup of tea. So
Very nice.
yeah, so the book looks like this now, and it's all in one volume. And what is in that volume? Well, basically, as you say, Tolkien wrote a lot of things in his life about Numenor. I think, in a way, somebody described the Second Age of Middle Earth as being a kind of bridge between the things that Tolkien had written about in the Silmarillion, which are kind of like before the First Age, and then the First Age with the great stories about Beren and Luthien and so on. And this was his kind of way of trying to work out how to link that great matter of Middle Earth that he'd written about in the Silmarillion with the Third Age, which he'd written about in The Hobbit and most prominently in The Lord of the Rings. And so he started trying to join up these pieces of writing, and this is very much the way, as we all know, that Tolkien worked. If it was a map, he'd be adding bits on and moving things around. And similarly with the text, he wanted to have a kind of a sense of creating an entire, well, what we now call a legendarium, but which in his time he would readily talked about as being a kind of modern myth, a myth for, well, he talked about it as a myth for England, but it was something which he saw as having an entire continuity to it. So these writings, of course, none of us really knew about when he was alive.
Right.
In point of fact, I'm old enough, of course, to have seen the first publication of the Silmarillion and then later Unfinished Tales, and those books were edited by his son Christopher, were a revelation, because we suddenly discovered that there was this mass of material, which some of which had been hinted at in The Lord of the Rings, but suddenly we were reading what he wanted to tell us about those early days for the first time. So it was a revelation. I remember a lot of people being terribly disappointed with the Silmarillion when it came out, Matt, because what they basically wanted was another Lord of the Rings, and they hadn't got it. They'd got these sort of biblical stories about the creation and the founding of the universe and that kind of thing, followed by this long history about the elves and the adventures to do with the Silmarils and heroes like Beren and his love for Luthien and so on. But of course, we'd heard of some of these things, because we'd heard of Beren and Luthien in The Lord of the Rings when Aragorn talks about them when he's talking to the hobbits. So we knew that there was all this stuff, but we didn't know the matter of it, what it felt like. So I remember feeling the Silmarillion was really, really exciting. It was exciting because it suddenly was fleshing out things to do with what I'd read in The Lord of the Rings, which I hadn't known, including, perhaps most importantly, not the Fall of Númenor, actually, because that was something I hadn't at that point. I don't think I had had got the same point of interest in. But certainly for me, as a young guy reading it, was the thing about how the Rings of Power came to be forged, the backstory to that, which, again, there's hints of it in the Council of Elrond, for example, where Elrond talks about those things, and Gandalf himself, of course, has given a warning to both Bilbo and Frodo about the importance of the ring, and it's explained to Frodo in Bag End just how powerful the one ring that Gollum had found and that Bilbo had then acquired and passed on to Frodo, just how powerful that ring was. So we knew those things were there, but suddenly they were fleshed out. So I found that passage of rings of the Rings of Power very, very evocative and exciting. But the book also contained, the Silmarillion also contained the Akelabeth, and that was an account of the fall of this romantic
Hmm.
5-point star shaped island, which had been given to men because of their loyalty in fighting alongside the elves against Morgoth and
Hmm.
his overthrow. So that was, tantalizing, and it obviously had links to Atlantis because it was about an island that eventually is destroyed consumed by the sea. It's actually
Yeah.
turned over and sunk, just like Atlantis in a way, but for different reasons. And that history of the people of Numenor and how they interact with the people of Middle Earth, and of course how, as a result of what happened there and the relationship between those two places, how the rings came to be forged and how the rings came to find themselves in Middle Earth. So all of that matter of the legend, as it were, became, unwrapped for us. And of
Yeah.
course, as you know, Matt, in 12 volumes, uh, Christopher Tolkien went on to open more and more doors into his father's writing. But as you say, all the stuff to do with Numenor, in fact, all the stuff to do with the Second Age, is really scattered through. Well, I think it's obviously a few primary books because you've got the
Hmm.
Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, but then several of the volumes of the history of Middle Earth,
Yeah.
Sauron Defeated, the Peoples of Middle Earth, they contain elements of that story as well, or Christopher's notes about it, or
Hmm.
corrections and amendments. So the idea was to bring as much of that matter together about the Second Age and put it in a single book. And always, I have to say, because it's quite important that I say this, although there's no new material of found by Christopher or uncovered, this is all material which is already there,
Yeah.
but always it's accompanied by notes which tell you, if you really want to know more about this, you can go to this volume and you can find out more. And there's extra things you might like to read in this volume. So there's
Yeah.
lots of notes, but they're all at the back. So if you don't want to read it, you don't have to. But if you just want to follow the story chronologically of the Second Age, you can do that, or you can dive in and find more stuff and follow it up.
Yeah, and I did see a sneak peek that was released, and I noticed your footnotes were very thorough, and I was very excited to see that if there's anything you could possibly want to dive deeper on, you've got a footnote directing you to where to go.
Yeah, well, I hope that is the case. I'm sure that the Tolkien aficionados will find things and say, well, he didn't link to that, did he? And there is a comment about that. I think one of the hard things in putting the book together, really, Matt, has been the fact that, Tolkien, as we know, on everything that he wrote, he constantly updated it, amended it, changed it, tweaked it, sometimes just adding notes in the margin. And Christopher, of course, spent most of his life after his father's death
Hmm.
unraveling those mysteries and giving them to us in the most coherent way that he could. But there are, of course, variations on some of these stories, and some of them appear in different volumes in slightly different versions. So there were times when I had to decide which is the version which reads best for
Yeah.
the needs of this book. And sometimes I've collaborated or brought together things from totally different sources. So, for example, the feeling of Numenor as an island is something which Tolkien spent a lot of time writing about. What it looked like, its landscape, its nature, the lives of the people, the cities, their pastimes and sports, their worship and spiritual beliefs, all of those kind of things. Their how they raised their children, how often they had children. He went into an enormous detail about it all, but in lots of different places. And there is a section called A Description of Numenor, which will be well known to readers of Tolkien's the first books that Christopher published. But recently there was a book by Carl Hofstetter which is called The Nature of Middle Earth, and he'd introduced some new material about Numenor. So all that has been drawn in as well. So I can't say that it is the most comprehensive version that can ever be printed, because I'm sure people will find things. And what the book doesn't do, it doesn't give you all the permutations. So you can't go to the book and say, well, that's the first version, this is what the second one looks like. Because what I wanted to do, most of all, because I'm a storyteller, Matt, I'm not really an academic. And what I wanted to do was to be able to give people a feeling of the story of the Second Age as best as I could, using Tolkien's own words, not my own,
Yeah.
and try and convey that. And when I was looking for a framework, I thought, how am I going to do this? And I thought, well, in the appendices to the Lord of the Rings, there's a section called The Tale of Years, and Tolkien sets out his own chronology in great detail of the Third Age, which is the Lord of the Rings period, down to date specific about where Frodo and Sam and Gollum are at a certain date and where Aragorn is and so on. But for the Second Age, he does have a page and a half of dates and the reign of the king or queen of the time, various things that happened, like boats leaving to go to Middle Earth, that kind of thing. So I thought that's going to be my framework, the skeleton, if you like, on which I will hang all of the bits and pieces, so that when you're reading it, you can actually, as far as possible, read everything Tolkien wrote about the Second Age in the order of the years of its, of its timeline, really. So that's how it's being constructed.
Now, I'm curious, because the process that you went through, I imagine, kind of mirrors that of Christopher's when he was writing something like the Silmarillion. Did this give you a new appreciation for Christopher's work in a way?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think I'd ever doubted Christopher's abilities, but it's certainly, and indeed, you're right. But of course, I didn't have to do one thing that Christopher had to do, which was to transcribe all his father's manuscripts.
Right. Yeah. Reading that handwriting is no joke.
Printed versions of them, so I had it easy, actually. But yes, you're right. I mean, I went through all of the volumes and looked for everything that I might be able to find there, and then made decisions about what was going to go in, or what could or couldn't go in, and what was possible but maybe wasn't right to go in, and pages and pages of notes. And because I hate marking books, I never mark any of my books. I never turn over the corner of a page, or make even pencil marks on a book. I'm reluctant to ever do. So what I did was, I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I just bought a complete set of, as they stand now, all the books, paperbacks. And then I thought, now these are just new editions. They're umpty-ump reprints. They're nothing particular, and I can just treat them like they are source material. So I can mark pages, stick stickers in it, cross passages out, put references to other books and other pages, which is what I did. So I had this heap of books that I was constantly going around with. I kept getting confused because the material, as you point out, is in lots of different volumes. I kept getting confused about where material was, even though I was working with it the whole time. I kept picking up the Silmarillion instead of Unfinished Tales and things like that. For goodness sake, it's not it's in the other book. It was a testimony, as you say, to just how this great puzzle of Tolkien's writings had been. The solution, the resolution of the maze had been worked out by Christopher before me, and without Christopher's work, this book wouldn't have happened, obviously, because so the book is very much indebted to Christopher, and Christopher. I'm quite clear about honouring Christopher in my introduction, and indeed Christopher's name as editor of all those other books appears alongside mine on the title page, which is very important to me. So, but of course, what we haven't touched on, which I'm sure you're going to ask me, is, are there any pictures in the book?
There are indeed. Yes, we're very excited. I love the cover, and I saw on your Facebook, we saw a little sneak peek of one that Alan Lee did of the faithful. Some of the faithful being led to be sacrificed in the Temple of Melkor on Numenor, which is incredible. But the cover in particular that you showed a little bit ago is just amazing.
This is what it looks like, because all copies of the book have this printed. Have I shown the right page yet? Have it as the front end paper of the book, and it is, I think, an extraordinary piece of work by Alan. And I don't know, I think it's probably now on the net, but if you look at, when you get a chance to look at it close, I don't think I can actually show you by holding it up here, but on this point of the collapse here of Armenilos, you can, if you look carefully, you can see Sauron standing on one of the the tops of the falling buildings. So yeah, it's a beautiful piece of work. I think one of his most, it's hard to with Alan's work, is all his work is so magnificent,
Oh,
but
absolutely.
I think with in a way it's some of the most dramatic work of his I've ever seen. And you mentioned the one of the faithful being led to the temple of Morgoth to be slain, it's sacrificed on Numenor, and I think all the illustrations in the book, more or less, are pictures which Alan really wanted to make because he'd never had the opportunity to make them before.
Yeah,
And I mean, you should really talk to Alan about his work on this. I'm sure you will, because
absolutely.
his work is fantastic. I mean, there are 10 plates in the book. There's the cover, which is also the front end paper, and then there's upward of 50 plus pencil drawings through the book
Yeah.
of the pieces of landscape, of key figures in the story, incidents, just amazing pencil sketches as well. So it's a very illustration heavy book, but I love that fact, and Alan worked on it so passionately. I think because
Yeah.
for him, as I say, it was an excitement of being able to tackle scenes he hadn't done before.
Yeah.
You know,
I was very pleasantly, you mentioned the 50 plus pencil sketches, which was something that I don't think was mentioned in the initial release. So I was just expecting the color images. And so
yes.
when I saw the preview and I saw all these pencil sketches, I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing. I love this." Like
Well,
there's more than I
I,
thought there
I,
would be.
yeah, well, I don't think Alan has a capacity for constantly. He's not an artist like well, let's say anybody else, because it's not true necessarily. But some artists would probably say, I was commissioned to do X number of pictures. That's what I've
Yeah.
done. I've done it. The job's done. But Alan just kept. I think because he was excited by the text, he
Yeah.
just kept drawing and drawing. And indeed, some of the drawings were done only a matter of a day or two before everything went off to the press. He just kept
Oh
saying, "No,
wow.
I've got some more. I've got another drawing I want to put in there." There's that. So he really got excited by it. I mean, it hasn't been revealed yet, and or prior to the book coming out. So I'm not going to reveal it because I know it's something that people will want to see for the first time when they open the book. But there is, and I alluded to it actually long ago as June when the press announcement came out.
Mm.
But one of the pictures I'm most excited by is the fact that Alan wanted to do a picture of not of Numenor, a picture of Khazad-dûm
Mm.
in Moria at the height of its great appeal.
Ooh.
When it was at its most wonderful, its most brilliant,
Yeah.
and he'd never had a chance to do that because always the pictures were of in the Lord of the Rings are
Yeah.
Khazad-dûm after its despoilment by the orcs and the Balrog and so on. So he got he wanted to do that, and the perfect moment for that is just one line that appears in one of the manuscripts, which talks about how Galadriel, and this is at the point, of course, when the elves and the dwarves were working together.
Yeah.
Galadriel passed through Khazad-dûm into the east side of Middle Earth, on
Right.
her way to Lothlorien.
Yeah.
Celeborn would not accompany her because he wouldn't go through, not through hostility, but just a slight distrust of the dwarves. But I think also he didn't like the idea of being underground.
Yeah.
So we don't know how Celeborn got to the other side, other than he had to go down to what later became the Gap of Rohan and go at the end of the mountains and then up the other side northwards, or he had to go as the Fellowship tried to do over the mountains and come down
Right.
the other side. But we do know that Galadriel went through, and there is this stunning illustration by Alan of Khazad-dûm in all its glory. I mean, it looks fantastic, with Galadriel on a horse, accompanied by the elves, meeting the
Ah.
dwarves as they pass through the mines of Khazad-dûm, and those are the kind of illustrations that excite me. But the one you mentioned particularly, I find really interesting, and there's another one of the building of Barad-dûr during the
Mm.
process of Sauron creating Barad-dûr in Mordor. The illustrations that most beguile me are these ones where Alan hints at the size and the bulk of the architectural
Yeah.
elements by only showing you a very small piece of it.
Hmm.
You know, the illustration you're referring to, yes, there's a great staircase up which the doomed faithful are making their way, and there's quite evidence of some kind of a sacrificial area, and there are bowls of fire, and there appear to be sort of runways or gullies through which presumably the blood of the sacrifices runs away. But
Yeah.
although there's, you know, certain elements are very clear and precise, you don't understand. The only way you understand the size of this building is in relation to what you can see of the landscape in the background, and you realize
Mm.
just how big this building is, even though you're only seeing, you know, a section of it. It's an amazing
Yeah.
way of being able to convey the height and the bulk of a building by only showing you an element of it and making that element in relation to the landscape. There's so much about Alan's pictures which are just magical and stunning and beautiful, of course. So I think
Yeah.
that's probably what I most, and I keep saying to people who sometimes people say to me, so what's new in this book? You know, what's new? Is there anything new of Tolkien in there? And I go, well, if you don't like the text, so you've got it elsewhere. What you haven't got is over 70 illustrations, paintings, and drawings by Alan Lee, and that's got to be worth buying. You know, you can forget all the text pages. Just look at the pictures.
Yeah, well, we certainly won't sell the text short, but yeah, the pictures are very exciting. The subject of the size of the Temple of Melkor actually came up on one of my live streams the other day as we were talking about the book and looking at that new image. And you're
Yeah,
totally right. We were in awe of the scale of the Temple of Melkor, and you're totally right. He does a masterful job of not needing to show you the entire building to
yeah,
give you that sense of scale. You see the people on there, and you
yeah,
know it just kind of goes off the frame. It's so massive it can't even fit on the frame, you know.
exactly. And if you saw it as a in its full image, as it were, then you wouldn't see the people that are on the
Right.
steps or the whatever.
Yeah.
So by actually, as you say, giving it that human scale makes you realize just the vastness of it. So it's a
Yeah.
brilliant. It's a brilliant device. There's also, as I say, there's the creation of Barad-dûr, which has a similar effect. And of course, because Alan is very aware of how he places drawings, because it's placed on the right-hand page of the spread, so the building, as it were, lies in the gutter of the
Mm,
book. So you really, if it was the other way around, it wouldn't feel quite the same. It's because we
right.
know we're just seeing this edge of a building, which, you know, is lost to us, but we can immediately see how huge and enormous it is. Yeah.
Now, I'm curious with working with Alan, is there any conversation, like, was there any
Mhm.
conversations between the two of you about, you know, what moments would be great illustrations? Or is Alan Lee one of those where you just say, hey, Alan, illustrate this book for us, and then you just let him go?
Well, we did let him go, obviously, but
Or is it
early
just a
on,
combination thereof?
well, it was a combination. Early on, we had an early call on the project, and by which time I'd more or less assembled the text, and we had a conversation about what things would, you know, could work and might be there, and so the conversation about Khazad-dûm early on, Alan said to me, I really want to paint Khazad-dûm as it would have looked at the height of its splendor.
Hmm.
And then, you know, we found this particular opportunity, which also brought Galadriel into the image as well, which of course is got its own, you know, a different resonance, but
Yeah.
also is something he hadn't drawn, the idea of Galadriel in association with the dwarves. So that came out of that discussion. Building of Barad-dûr came out of that discussion. We talked about the fact that one of the pictures we wanted to show was a feeling of the people of Numenor looking towards the west, and there
Mm,
is a painting which reflects that, of people looking westward from the port on Numenor, so that they've, you know, there's a sense of the horizon beyond, and lots of other things. Like I said to Alan, can we please have some dancing bears? They're
yeah.
quite small. They're quite small, but there are dancing bears in there. And we talked about foliage and flowers and birds and things that could provide little vignettes. So yeah, there was quite a lot of conversation. And Alan, I what I learned from working with Alan on this, I've known Alan for 50 years, but we've never worked on a project in any way together. And the one thing I realized was just how thorough he is in going through a manuscript and finding matter within it that triggers ideas for him. And that I found, I mean, he said to me at one point, "Oh, I've had this idea for a drawing. I won't spoil it because it will give things away." But he said, "I had, an idea for this," and he knew my text so well, and my text, I'm saying, I mean, my assembled text, Tolkien's text. He knew it so well that he was able to pinpoint, elements that would be just capture a mood or a moment. And obviously there are very dramatic moments like Sauron giving in to Pharazôn, surrendering, kneeling before him. Of course, he's kneeling before him because he's got a plan of what's going to happen when he goes to Numenor. He wasn't really surrendering, but in his false guise, he appeared to be giving up.
Yeah,
and that's very clear what that moment is. But there are other moments where there's just a sense of maybe it's a seascape or a piece of landscape, or there's just things which just enhance and embellish the story. And they're things that he's picked up from Tolkien's writing. So working with somebody who was so indebted to the text and working through it and looking for things and was excited by it. I mean, the great thing about Alan is his quiet excitement. He doesn't get he doesn't wave his arms around, and his voice doesn't get high and excited like mine does quite a lot of the time. But there's this genuine, absolute kind of devotion to what he's doing, and he's steeped in Tolkien. I mean, he's been there for so long. I mean, like John Howe, they've lived with this legendarian for so long that I think there's hardly anything you could say to either of them, but in this case to Alan, where he wouldn't instantly know how he was going to depict it. The shape of a ship, or the look of somebody's headdress or a helmet, those kind of things. So it was very, very much a collaborative thing at the beginning. And all the time, Alan would show me the pictures as he was doing them, so I could see, how it was developing. We used to have Zoom calls with my editor, Chris Smith, and Alan. And Chris always thought it was, I think it's probably right as an editor, you never push the artist to, show you what you're working on. But Chris knew that every time we did a call together, at some point in the call, Zoom call, I would say, "So, how are the pictures, Alan?" And he'd go, and then he'd lean across and pick something up. "I've just done this. What do you think of it?" So that was thrilling because I've never had that opportunity. I've worked with other illustrators, but I've never worked with somebody where the process of creation was something which I saw unfolding. So Alan Lee, buy the book for Alan's pictures. If you don't mind the text that goes with it, that's okay as well.
Well, I'm sure they're both phenomenal and go very well together. So I wanted to back up a little bit here and ask, how did the idea for this book come about?
Yeah, well, HarperCollins had been thinking for some time that this was an area, a subject that really ought to be brought into one book. They'd been looking at as the great tales had been published in ways where the text was brought together. But Numenor was obviously was much more tricky because it was dissipated amongst so many different volumes, and it had a very particular need or approach to how you would put it together. So it had been on their mind for a long time. Obviously, everybody was aware that Amazon Prime were going to be launching the Rings of Power, and so there was going to be, for the first time for many, many viewers of anything to do on film with Tolkien, an awareness of the fact that these things went on years before the Lord of the Rings.
Right.
So clearly there was, if you like, a potential market of readers who would not know necessarily anything about the Second Age. Of course, what none of us were aware of, because the Rings of Power hadn't landed at that point, I suppose none of us at that point were aware of just where they were going to enter into the second age as
Yeah.
filmmakers. That they were actually not going to, apart from a sort of prologue material, that they weren't, or flashbacks, they weren't actually going to go into the matter of the second age until you get to year 3000 and whatever it is, or thereabouts.
Yeah.
When our Pharazon's on the scene, we're
Yeah.
talking about actually the last days of Numenor. Really, it could have been
Yeah.
called the last days of Numenor, like the last days of Pompeii. But uh, but that was obviously, that was in everybody's minds. But the book as a concept had been talked about for a long time. And when HarperCollins came to me and said, would I be interested in tackling this? I know they came to me not as somebody who was, and I'm not being sort of overly modest about this, but I knew that they hadn't come to me as somebody who was a scholar who was having
Mm.
to unearth and analyze new material. That I would be coming to it as a storyteller,
Yeah.
as somebody who, for whom the story is the prime thing. Because as you know, I did a radio version, and I've written about Jackson's film versions and maps, and I've always written about those things in terms of the story, which is at the heart of it. So for me, it was an invitation to try, a daunting one, I have to say. I mean, when I look at the book now, I do think, oh gosh, did I have any qualms about this? And if I'm honest, yes, I did at the beginning, because I thought, well, the bulk of the material, well, it seemed like the bulk of the material, it didn't turn out to be the case, but the bulk of the material is already there in the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, with a lot of other stuff aside. And how will this all hold together? And what do I do, for example, when we come to the story of Aldarion and Erendis? Because for there's an example where it's a long narrative, it's a huge chunk of one of the original publications, but of course it was incomplete, and Christopher had to pull together the strands that he found to finish the story. And of course it spans a number of years in this chronology. So that text is there in its entirety, but it's interrupted by other events chronologically as they come up. So it's a different way of reading the book and the matter, I suppose. But the moment I went back to HarperCollins and said, for me, the only logical way to deal with this is the tale of years, the chronology, and that if we stick with that chronology, then we know that that's obviously it's not the last word, because there's all kinds of things that are wrong with that chronology and the conflict sometimes between that chronology and the line of Elros documents. So, but by and large, as long as we tell people where there's a difference, or there's a date which has got changed, and therefore there's an uncertainty, as long as we mention all those things, we can hold everything together by that chronology. And of course it goes from the founding of Numenor right the way through to the fall of Sauron, the overthrow of Sauron, and the taking of the ring, and then you're straying into the third era, third age, of course, with the death of Isildur. But the age is complete in that sense. And what I haven't said is, of course, I've also introduced into the book that, and again, this is one of the things I said I wanted to do when I accepted it. I said I really think it needs this, and the estate and HarperCollins accepted that and went with it. Was that I wanted to bring in material with which readers would be familiar already. I mean, I'm talking about matter from The Lord of the Rings. Essentially, I don't think there's anything in there from The Hobbit. There are obviously references to The Hobbit, but there are lots of references to the Second Age in The Lord of the Rings. I mean, I've mentioned a couple already. Gandalf talking about the forging of the One Rings, for example, and another example would be at the Council of Elrond, where Elrond himself talks about having been the standard bearer, the last alliance between elves and men, and how he witnessed Isildur taking the ring from Sauron's hand, and how he counseled Isildur at the time to destroy the ring, and how he didn't. So that those things are in the Council of Elrond.
Right.
But other things, like, for example, also at the Council of Elrond, where Gloin the dwarf talks about Khazad-dûm at its height of majesty. Where he recites a verse, in fact, a ballad, really. I think he sings it, and that's included. Or, for example, the comments which Legolas talks about to the Fellowship as they're approaching Lothlorien, when he's talking about that place. So those things are now woven in. They're quite clear. It's quite clear where they've come from.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's introduced as being, this is how it's said, or the finding of on Mount Lindaluin of the sprig of
Seedling.
the seedling of the white tree. Just on the eve of Aragorn's coronation. So those elements are woven into the story at the appropriate moment. It's like flash forwards and flash backwards. And another example I would say, which is worth noting, is the fact that in the Second Age, Tolkien doesn't write very much about the look of Mordor. He writes a great deal about the look of Numenor, but when it comes to Mordor, there's not a lot of graphic description. So I've inserted, always signaled as where it is and when it is, but those very graphic descriptions that he gives of Mordor when Sam and Frodo are on the last sort of a gasp of the quest. So you get those, and of course the passing of the passage of the Dead Marshes from the Lord of the Rings, and there's a reference to that in the passage about the Battle of Dagorland. So you get the kind of idea of those things are just there, and they're there as kind of like I see them as kind of markers. So for people who will go, oh, I remember that in the book, or I remember that, oh yes, that's in Jackson, yes, the thing with Isildur taking the ring, so I think that gives it maybe a bit more comfort for those people who are going to come to this with a lot of names that they've never come across, and in some instances not much history to go with those names, because it has to be said that there's a lot in this book, well, in the whole Tolkien's whole writing of the Second Age, where it's never been fleshed out. It's never been, there are stories there waiting to be written about some of those monarchs and some of those events. And some of them are just in passing. But I love the fact of Tar Melidor, for example, and about his interest in astronomy and things like that. But they're just glimpsed in a way. There's not a lot about them, but we know, here's a man for whom the business of being a king and ruling a country or a land, an island, was of less importance to him than his interest in the heavens and learning about that. But he put that aside and took up the mantle of responsibility. But there's not a lot else there. But already you've got a glimpse of a character that's really interesting and got his own story. So I hope a lot of those things will encourage people to search out more, but also I think maybe encourage some people who haven't done so to, maybe some new fan art and new ways of wanting to interpret some of the material that's now perhaps a little more accessible than it was before.
Yeah. Well, like you said, there's so many interesting nuggets, and I've always said that part of the thing that I both love and like wish that Tolkien had written more, because there's so many mysteries in his works. And then there's other things, like you said, like Tar Meneldur, who kind of sounds like a Numenorian astronomer almost, and that's it, and that's all we know, and there's no more to that story, and it's kind of an interesting nugget of a story. Now I'm curious, and I do want to say before we move on to the next question, I love that you've brought in things from Lord of the Rings. I think that's an excellent. It's even more convenient than I thought it was. it was already convenient, the fact that you're pulling all these together, because I've had so many people with, you mentioned the Rings of Power show. So many people say, okay, I want to read about the Second Age. What book should I get? And I'm like, well, here's the thing. And then I go on to list. I'm like, how deep do you want to go? Because I could give you a list of about 6. So now I can just say, pick up the Fall of Númenor. That's much easier entryway. And the fact that you've brought in, these descriptions from the Lord of the Rings, because like you said, there are many. I think that's an even greater, way for us to have kind of that point of reference.
There's a moment in account. I'm sure people who know the book will know it. But there's a moment in the Council of Elrond when Gandalf speaks about having been in the library at Minas Tirith
Hmm.
and gone through these old scrolls, which he believes only he and probably Saruman have ever seen before. And he tells the company, it's not in the film, so people won't necessarily, who just know Tolkien's Lord of the Rings from the film versions, won't necessarily know this, but there's a moment where Gandalf speaks about having read these and found amongst them a description that Isildur has given of the ring when he first took it up and put it on. He talks about how it was hot to the touch, but the moment he'd got it on, he acclimatized to wearing it, and how immediately he felt the specialness, the preciousness of that ring. Now that's he quotes that paper now, that document. So in the Fall of Númenor, I set the setting for that briefly, and then we have what is clearly Isildur's words as remembered, because they're in quotation marks, as they are remembered by Gandalf and recounted at the Council of Elrond, and that coming quite late as it does, which because it's placed at the moment when Isildur, having taken the ring at the overthrow of Sauron, returns to consider what he's going to do next. But before he sets off, it's his immediate reactions to the ring and its power, which is electrifying, because here is suddenly you're aware of this is the first person after Sauron to put on the ring, and to be aware of its powers and so on. And that, I think, that fits in there in a way. And if you want to go back and read the whole of the Council of Elrond, which is of course chock full of stuff about
absolutely,
the Second Age and a lot of other things, I think it's a good place. So those things for me were really important, because they were like, these are, as I say, markers or milestones, things which you could say, right, okay, so that plays into that. And I think that enriches, maybe, or could enrich your reading of the Lord of the Rings when you reread it. So yes, I hope people will find it useful in that sense. I mean, sadly, as I say, because the Rings of Power as a series doesn't really tell you anything much about Numenor prior to shortly before its demise. There's an awful lot in the book which you won't be, we're never going to hear the story about Darien on Amazon, are we? So, not even going to hear the story of Elros either, actually. So,
it doesn't seem that way, unfortunately.
Well, there's a sculpture of him, but a huge statue, but I assume it's Elros. But
I think it's actually Eärendil.
Oh, is it? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there a label on it somewhere?
Yeah.
I missed it. But but when Elrond said that he was an orphan, and didn't make reference to the fact that he had a brother called Elros, who was the first king of Numenor, I kind of wonder, but there you are.
Yeah. Now I'm curious. I want to be respectful of the time here, so I had a couple more questions I wanted to get in. Now, were there any surprises to you? As someone who has obviously been around these texts and been a fan of Tolkien's work for a long time, diving this deep into the writings, was there anything that surprised you along the way?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think seeing all together the descriptions of the island itself, I found absolutely fascinating. And what I've done, which is to explain how it's been arranged, Tolkien's descriptions in A Description of Numenor and in the writings which are subsequently published in the Nature of Middle Earth, those documents are quite, they range all over the place. Obviously, as Tolkien was writing things, he jotted them down, and things are strung together. What I've done is separate all of those things out. So we talk about the shape of the land, its geography, if you like. Then we talk about the natural life on the island. So we're talking about the foliage, the trees, the flowers, the plants, the animal life, and the animal life is extraordinary. I mean, apart from dancing bears, which people would remember if they read it, but also the other animals that are there and are not there, the fish, the birds, all this stuff is there, and I've drawn them together into sections. So there will be a section which says of birds and beasts or
Yeah.
whatever, and then you have all that material gathered together, and then you can read a section about their cities and what their cities look like and the kind of their rituals that they follow, particularly as they became more obsessed with death. The tombs and the memorializing
Right.
of the dead, and their yearning for immortality or longer life, and the rituals that take place on the top of Meneltama. So those things that surprised me, just how much there was written about Numenor in terms of its everything about it really, and I hadn't quite grasped that. I don't think. I mean, I don't see why I shouldn't have done, because it's all there. I haven't found anything wasn't there, but just putting it into a different order. And we did. John Howe and I did books based on The Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings, and Beleriand.
Hmm.
And I now know that you could do a book about Numenor of the same kind, because there's so much about the island that's memorialized there. So that I found really interesting and surprising. The other thing I think was just this realizing of the fact that Tolkien had, he'd put his own place markers into the story, which presumably he would have gone back to. I mean, there are several kings where we don't even know the names of the king's children, or we know the names of one of them, and there are two unnamed children, two unnamed siblings, but he never gave them names.
Yeah.
So there's this, and to me, this isn't just about being an unfinished manuscript, which of course, in a sense, it is, because the whole of the Legendarium is incomplete in so many ways. I mean, we have this intensely detailed passage which represents what's in the Lord of the Rings, and you've got a very intensely told myth about the creation in the beginning of the Silmarillion. So you've got all of those things, but then there are all these areas where things obviously took place and years passed. I mean, I could see absolutely why Amazon framed their show, or are framing their show, in the way that they are, because you could not create a serial which is based on 3,440 something years. You could not do that, because people would be dying off in every episode. You'd be jumping year on year on year. So the scope of that, the reason it intrigues me, well, it doesn't intrigue me so much, but the importance that I realize with that is just why we respond to the Legendarium itself in the way that we do, which is really because we're looking at bits and pieces of manuscript. We're looking at, it's like somebody unearthing elements of a past civilization, and you've got these fragments. It seems to me there's a similarity to, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or early manuscripts and documents, or hieroglyphs uncovered on walls and things. What we've got is just a snapshot of something. Sometimes it's just the name of a monarch, and that they ruled for 400 years, but we know nothing about what happened during that time specifically. So that to me enriches the story, because it makes it more like what we understand about myths and legends. Because whenever you read myths and legends, or folk tales or fairy tales even, you're always tempted to say, but what if, and why did that happen? And we don't know, so I think that just enriches the concept of how Tolkien garnered all these bits and pieces for himself from his writings, and saw it as being the discovery of a much bigger whole. And I think that comes through. I hope that comes through in the book very much.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's part of the magic. I've always said the part of the magic of Tolkien's world is how much it feels like you're reading about actual history.
And how you don't know stuff,
Right.
You know, that's part. I mean, in anything in history, you go, I mean, even in your own family, you go, oh, my great grandfather, there's a picture of my great grandfather. What did he did? What's that uniform he's wearing in this old photograph? All those things we don't know are just part of what we understand of the tapestry of our own lives and what we've experienced in our reading of literature. And it's not that what makes it separate from, say, the writings of Dickens, where Dickens creates an entire world in every one of his novels, and peoples it with characters who are very full and developed. Here you have something which is much closer to myth and legend. Tolkien said that thing once in one of his letters about talking about the Second Age as being a time where story becomes history. The bridge between the First and Second Age is a point where the stories, the myths, the legends suddenly become something historic. Well, of course, he's talking within his own the history of his own world, and certainly the reshaping of we haven't talked about, but the reshaping of the world itself, which happens with the cataclysm at when Numenor is overthrown. That, in a sense, is such a kind of resolution of those early mythologies about Middle Earth and the creation of Arda, and it's there. And now you're starting on to what is real history, which is the Quest of the Ring. Now it's all, of course, fantasy and it's all made up, but you just can't help feeling that sense of discovery, of archaeology. I would say that's what I would liken it to.
So that kind of leads into my next question. So as you mentioned, you kind of look at this from the vantage point of a storyteller, and that's what you are at your heart is a storyteller. So what would you say is the story of the Second Age? What's at the heart of the Second Age story?
Well, Tolkien said it because he said in several letters, but particularly in a letter he wrote to his friend and potential publisher, he wasn't in the end, but Martin Waldman, when he said that all stories are about a fall. And of course, here you have a devout Catholic speaking who is remembering the fact that both the Jewish and the Christian faith are based on the fact that mankind, at some point or other in its journey, has fallen from what he could have been to what he then is, and everything that follows is a result of that fall. And a famous British politician once said that no great career ends in anything other than failure. And if you think about it, that's true, because all the mightiest dictators and powers that we've known in our world always at the end have come to some kind of, either they're decrepit and incapable, rather like Denethor or Theoden might have been, or they are totally overthrown like Hitler and other dictators. So the failure and falling are obviously similar concepts. So for him, it's about fall. It's about corruption, I think, and the way in which not just power corrupts, but desire and greed and all kinds of things can corrupt you. And of course, the story of the Second Age is, because Numenor's at the heart of it, it is about this place which was a gift from the gods given to men. And it was a kind of way of saying you can't have the immortality that the elves have, but this is, you will have long life. And if you look after this world, which is a beautiful world that I've created for you, we've created for you, because they all had a hand in it, the Valar, in the way it was birthed. That this place is a gift, and it's your job to tend it and look after it. Not unlike perhaps the Garden of Eden in the Book of Genesis. So you're touching right back into the Judeo-Christian stories about creation and the fall from perfection, and from then on, it's how those people change. And they change through getting more powerful, of getting more, their belief that they are impregnable, that they are, if not immortal, they have long life and that everything is perfect. But then the entry of that desire for something more, always to have more. Why should the elves have that immortality? Why should the gods deny us this? We should go to the Valar. We should say to them, give us for everything we've done. And so that desire, which then becomes corrupting in the sense that, and it's only hinted at in some of these documents, but the idea that that they reached a point of such degradation that they were taking the faithful and even pillaging people from Middle Earth and bringing sacrifices, and their vanity, the fact that they fall for Sauron's deceits. This is the story. It's of a noble, as so many myths are, of course, about the noble brought low. the great warrior, the great leader who is brought to ruin, and the place is ruined. But there is a judgment. There's a judgment at the end. But there is also salvation. You know, I mean, I'm talking in these spiritual terms because although Tolkien obviously would have very strongly denied that any of this was intended as kind of an allegorical representation of what was in the Bible, but nevertheless, those elements that are deep within his faith, that was born into him by both his mother and also by the upbringing he then had when he was being looked after as a orphan, that these beliefs are deep within him, and there is redemption. There's redemption for some, as there is in the Lord of the Rings. Redemption. The redemption for Gollum is that he finally completes the quest which even Frodo wasn't able to execute when it came to the point. And there's salvation for the exiles who were true to the spirit of what Numenor stood for. That the very destruction of Numenor gives them safe passage to Middle Earth. Well, dangerous, but eventually safe passage.
Right.
And allows them to then bring down for the first time Sauron and seemingly destroy him. But even then, the fall happens again because Isildur, having got the ring, himself cannot let it go and keeps it, and it's his undoing, and it becomes Gollum's undoing, and nearly becomes Frodo's undoing at the very last. But so I think that's what the story is about. It's about the perfect being distorted, changed. It's about corruption. It's about envy. It's about greed. It's about beauty despoiled. And it's about how we always, with Tolkien, to my mind, there's this thing about these are the things you should be watching for in your society. And I said, I was giving a talk at Oxenmoot for the Tolkien Society in the summer, and we were talking about the scouring of the Shire, which Jackson left out of the films, and which I managed to keep within the radio version with a bit of a struggle. But to me, that's what's so vital, is that the everything that goes, these huge, big, vast matters of honor and valor and all the rest of it, and bravery, all of those are, as we know, not enough in comparison with the small people who carry out the task, like Frodo and Sam. But we also know that the battle actually ends not on the plains of Morgoth. The battle, not in front of the Black Gates, it actually ends on the doorstep of Bag End. And that, which seems to me to be Tolkien, and maybe it was born onto him by his experiences in the First World War and his reactions to the Second World War. I don't know, but I think there's a sense of Tolkien understanding that the fight isn't always to the most powerful; it's often to the weakest. But most importantly, that the enemy, as Lincoln said famously in one of his speeches, and when he was president in America, was that the enemy doesn't come from without. The enemy ultimately will come from within, and the enemy within is an awful lot of what Tolkien is writing about.
Yeah, definitely. We see that in Numenor for sure.
Yeah, and you see it in Lord of the Rings. You see it with Boromir. You see it with Denethor. You see it with characters who are, complex in their reaction to things. It could have been born through Galadriel, but she resists the temptation, or Gandalf, who resists the temptation. But Denethor falls for it. Faramir could have fallen for it, but didn't in the end. And I find it interesting that Faramir is so perplexed in Jackson's films, because that's not how he's represented in the book. But Boromir is a perfect example. An honourable man who makes the wrong decision because actually there's a weakness there, and weakness leads to falling. If you're frail like I am as an old man, if you're frail, you fall over easy. So falling and failing is what the story is about. But I think it touches just about everything Tolkien wrote. If you even go back to The Hobbit, where it seems subliminal, there it's even there in the greed of the dwarves and the greed of each of the parties, particularly in towards the end, when they've got a common enemy and yet they're fighting amongst themselves. And my goodness, doesn't it speak to the lives that we are all living today? You know,
Hmm.
I mean, in different terms, but
Yeah, yeah.
I doubt. I'm sure your reaction to politics and political scene in America, and I certainly know that ours in Britain in the year 2022 is very much that we're looking at all of those elements and just seeing how they're playing into our daily lives.
Hmm. Yeah, you can't turn your head, it seems like, without some political thing going on, and yeah, that's why I prefer to spend my time in Middle Earth as much as I
I
can. You
don't
know.
blame you. I don't blame you, Matt.
Now, I just had a couple more quick questions for
Okay.
you. So you mentioned we mentioned a couple times here. You know, the book obviously is going to have some you know crossover where folks are looking to this book after or perhaps before, who knows, with the Rings of Power coming out. So have you watched the series, and if so,
Yes, I've seen
what?
the first season. Yeah.
Okay, so what did you think of, as someone who's been diving into the Second Age material?
Well, I'm very conscious that it's the first of 5 seasons,
Hmm.
so uh, I don't know how it's going to develop. I mean, the first season in its first 8 episodes has already thrown up many surprises of
Yeah.
things of great interest. So I can't predict how it's going to go. The things I feel most positive about the Rings of Power series is that Amazon have certainly put, as we crudely say, the money's on the screen because it
Yeah.
looks sensational. More importantly than it looking sensational, to me, is the fact that they very, very wisely, and obviously they've had John Howe on board as working on the conceptual designs,
Yeah.
that it chimes well with Peter Jackson's films. You
Hmm.
feel comfortable in entering this world. It is to you no surprise that the elven structures that we see are similar to the ones we remember from Rivendell
Right.
or Minas Tirith. So these, the whole architectures of men and elves is very much that we knew from the Lord of the Rings films. And so I think people will come into the world and feel comfortable with being there. It won't be a huge culture shock.
Yeah.
The kind of culture shock we would have had, I'm sure, though I'm sure it would have been a brilliant film if Guillermo del Toro had made The
Oh,
Hobbit.
right. Yeah.
Because I think then we would have gone, whoa, that's nothing like what we saw in The Lord of the Rings. Really exciting, but nothing like what we saw there. So this
Yeah.
is that it's an astute move of Amazon to get John Howe on board, and to say we're going to make it. It's honoring the Jackson films
Hmm.
in its look. I mean, the play, what you see on screen looks fantastic. I think
Yeah.
where you get to see the New Zealand landscape, it is as it was in the Jackson films, breathtaking. I hope they match that when they are filming in Scotland and Ireland and Wales
Hmm.
or wherever they're shooting now for the second season. But I think if I have issues with it, it is to do with the minutiae. Really, I'm watching a drama unfolding, and I'm constantly having to just readjust my state of mind to say,
Hmm.
yeah, that didn't actually happen there, but I can see why it's happening there in this, in this story.
Yeah.
There are lots of questions I have. Do I really believe that the stranger is Gandalf? And who else could it be?
Yeah.
Is it Radagast? Some people say, well, even if it's Radagast, he shouldn't be there either.
Right. I'm really hoping for Blue Wizard. I
Well,
maybe
but even
maybe
they
it's a
should be,
fool's hope,
but
but
yeah, but they shouldn't be there, Matt. So I mean, we know that the
well,
Astari came at the beginning of the Third Age. So, uh, but who knows?
yeah.
I've toyed with the thought of, could it be Tom Bombadil, who is the eldest, as Gandalf refers to him? So
Yeah.
I don't know. Um, could it be? Could it be Bjorn? And then I thought, no, it can't be Bjorn because it's not a significant enough character for
Right.
people to register from the film,
Hmm.
because Jackson kind of threw away Bjorn in The Hobbit. He didn't really give him the stature which I think he should have had in the films. Well, I
Yeah.
think it was there, but it got edited out
Yeah,
essentially.
I that is one of my laments from The Hobbit is
Hey, it
how
is, isn't
little
it?
Beorn we got. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so much went into making it.
Yeah.
I know how much was shot and the extent of it and so on. But so there are those mysteries hanging there. Why is I mean, it was inevitable that Galadriel would be a warrior queen.
Mhm.
That was that was written in the stars. We knew that was going to happen. It had to
Yeah.
happen. I am perplexed by Elrond's involvement with Kelly Brimbor and being involved with the forging of the rings, and certainly the fact that he doesn't seem to have a relationship which he should have with the past of Numenor. His brother having been king. Those things perplex me, but we have to accept it as it is and what it is, the same way as we accepted Jackson's interpretation. And much will go on and change as the series develops, I'm sure. I've no doubt about that. I think there's some very good acting in it. I think there's some less than great script writing, but the problem which one always faces with Tolkien is, how do you balance people talking like real people and at the same time people talking like heroic characters from mythology? And Tolkien himself doesn't reconcile that for you. You just live with it in the book, but it's a challenge when you put it on, when I was putting it on radio or Jackson putting it on film, that characters suddenly move into a kind of high language which is not the common speech. So I think they've got a lot of challenges. I think it was slightly slow getting off the ground. First episode, I thought, where they had so much to try and convey, but I thought it had great pace, great energy, great drama. The dramatic action scenes are what you would want from action scenes. So you just have to put your mind in a different place when you're watching it. You have to say, oh, I didn't know that Mithril actually was the salvation of the Elvish race, but there we are. Oh, I do now, right? Like that. And
that's one I'm really struggling with, Brian.
Well,
I'm gonna admit.
But, if you stick a bit of Mithril near your ailing white tree, it will come back to life, and that's that's new. But also, what we have to remember. I mean, Tolkien, despite the fact that he talked about, many minds and many hands and so on, carrying on the mythology, I think the truth of the matter is that he would have reacted quite strongly to anything that changed what he'd done. When I was writing the radio version, I was constantly thinking, oh God, what did he think about what I'm doing now? He would have hated just simply by putting the Lord of the Rings into chronological narrative order. He would have loathed that. So, but the fact is that there's two things that are really important. I really want to say. One is that it is the thing itself is unchanged. The books are there. The story and the mythology as created by Tolkien is not subsumed by anything that the rest of us have done. And it will endure beyond that and can always be gone back to. So that is, that's a very important thing. We're not talking about an oral tradition of a story where now we read the Brothers Grimm and we read the version of the story that they tell us about not Cinderella, but Sleeping Beauty, for example, or Red Riding Hood, or whatever the story might be. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, best example. We know what they wrote about it, and people have gone on changing it since. But we don't know of all the oral versions that the Brothers Grimm heard told to them. What other versions? We don't know how they chose the version that they wrote down.
Right.
So that in a way. But The Lord of the Rings is different because it's all there. Everything that Tolkien wrote himself in his lifetime and everything that Christopher has unearthed, edited and put together is all there. And nothing that anybody does on film, in music, on the stage, on radio is ever going to wipe that out. You can just go back to it. And the second thing is, I suppose that I also feel strongly that if people come to anything, whether it's Jackson's films or the Rings of Power, what they may take from it is just the superficial thing that they enjoy watching. But they may also think, I want to know more about this. Maybe I'll go to the books about this. I know that when Jackson's films opened, I saw people on trains and subways sitting there reading the book because the film was out and they wanted to go to the book to find out more. So it will lead people back to the books. And if it doesn't lead people back to the books, the people will still come away with a sense, an essence of this extraordinary creativity that is Tolkien. So they will have some, grain of element of what they're actually thinking about. Just as if you read one Jane Austen book or one Charles Dickens book, you won't necessarily understand the whole of that writer's characterizations and plots and stories, but you'll have an inkling of what
Hmm.
their world, their creativity was like, and that's vitally important to me.
Absolutely. So last question.
Yep.
Do you have any what's next for you? Do you have any future books planned, or is this kind of like the calm after the storm, I guess we could say?
It is the calm after the storm. I don't know. Is the short answer. I've no idea whether there's anything Tolkien down the line, but then that's been my life in connection with Tolkien for over 40 years. When I first read the book, I had no idea that I would one day get to do a radio version. That was 41 years ago.
Hmm.
I had no idea when I'd done that somebody would say, why don't we do some books of maps with John Howe doing pictures and you doing a kind of introduction and gazetteer. That came out of nowhere. Well, not quite, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then the movie books, when the movies were starting, I had no involvement with the film other than that Peter Jackson knew of my radio versions and knew of other things I'd done. And then I became involved with the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit and Jackson's personal story. So, there've just always been these kind of things that have come up. And in between whiles, I've done radio programs about Tolkien and his legacy, put together compilations of things. So this is another one, but it's just another stage in the journey, which may,
Yeah.
maybe the last one for me. I don't know, but it may not. What else I want to do? Yeah, I've got other things that I want to do. I'm also sort of focusing on trying to get my physical life better. I'm 73 now, so I'm not as young as I was, and although there's a young body trapped inside this decaying corpse, I'm anxious to try and get myself to a point where I'm fitter than I was. So I'm going to have some operations to help my seized up body, and that would give me a new lease of life. But yeah, there's other things I'd like to do. I'd love to write a book about my favorite children's books, something I'd quite like to do. I've got a sort of started book about Venice, which is a place I love. I'm passionate about, and I love, incidentally, the way that the Rings of Power have used this kind of essence of Venice in their creation of the visuals, which comes, of course,
Yeah.
from Tolkien, because Tolkien himself wrote in one of his letters and said, "I've just returned from Numenor." No, actually Venice. So we know that there is an element of that Venetian
Yeah.
seascape, actually, which is, a layer upon layer of age and history piled one on top of the other, and of course floating on water, rather like Numenor. So I'd love to finish the book. Would like to write about Venice, but I just have to do it for myself because nobody wants to publish it. During lockdown, I started writing some humorous verses, Ogden Nash-like. I'd like to find an illustrator who would do those, illustrate them and publish them. So yeah, I've got things there, but nothing I know about. But my life as a writer, which is now over, well, nearly 50 years,
Yeah.
has always been just a series of discoveries. And obviously, as you get older, you don't have the same stamina that I had when I was 20 or 30 or 40. But I do still have the desire to tell stories.
Yeah.
I excite people. The one thing I've always wanted to do in my, not just my career, in my life actually, is to entice and excite people about things that excite me. I
Yeah.
don't think, Matt, I've ever done anything in my career, only a couple of times I would admit to, where I've done something which was, I didn't really have a heart in, my soul in it.
Yeah.
And I've been lucky, because I've worked with books, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis Carroll, Ray Bradbury, people who either I knew, like Ray Bradbury, or writers about whom I felt passionately, like Lewis and Tolkien, or Lewis Carroll, or James Barrie, or any of the T.H. White, any of the other writers, Mervyn Peake. I keep thinking of people about whose lives I have been part of in some way or other, either
Yeah.
initially or distantly, and who have played into my work. And that's, for me, it's like A.A. Milne, who I also have a great interest in, and Winnie
Yeah.
the Pooh. A.A. Milne, his most favorite book, happens to be one of my favorite books, is Kenneth Graham's The Wind in the Willows. And
Oh,
A.A.
yeah.
Milne once wrote, if I was found myself in the dock and the judge said to me, is the one thing you, as he put on the black cap to signify that I was going to go to execution, is the one last thing you want to say to the gentlemen and ladies of the jury? Milne said, yes, I'd like to say, Your Honour, if you haven't read if you haven't read The Wind in the Willows, you must do so, because it is one of the finest books in the world. So I think that's kind of my passion, that if at the time somebody said to me, is any final words? And I would say, yes, go and read these books. And of course, The Lord of the Rings would be absolutely among them, no question.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for your time today. Everyone, make sure you go snag your copy of The Fall of Númenor. It is out as of today. If you're watching this interview, it is out. There's both a regular and a deluxe edition available, as well as, we didn't even mention this, but the audiobook narrated by the great Samuel West, who's done a number of previous books for Tolkien.
With me chipping in with the introduction and notes as well.
Okay, I was wondering because that's what Samuel did with his father on who's unfortunately passed away now. But with Beren and Luthien and the Fall of Gondolin, they went back and forth, one reading Christopher's notes, one reading the story. So you guys did a similar thing for this audiobook.
We did.
Fantastic. Well,
so
there you go.
My second breakfast mug to you. I'd say cheers to you and to all your watchers and listeners. I can't remember how many people have watched our last conversation. Last time I looked, it was some astronomical number, but it's been great fun to be with you today, Matt, as always.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, it's always a pleasure, Brian. You definitely have an open invitation anytime. And for those of you who haven't already, I am a huge advocate for the BBC radio drama that Brian wrote, and it's wonderful. It's a mainstay on my Audible app on my phone. I pop it on all the time in the car. So check that out. Check out our previous interview where we talked for something like 3 hours about
It was,
the BBC radio drama. There's some wonderful behind the scenes story about that, and some behind the scenes stories about the Peter Jackson films, like some really amusing things about Christopher Lee. I'll just tease it at that. If that's not enough, I don't know what it is. But Brian, thank you again so much for joining us. And
great to
really looking forward to the book. And folks, go grab your copy and dive into Tolkien's Second Age as edited by Mr. Brian Sibley. And we will see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.